Here is part 1, expanded to 1,300 words, written in simple, clear, and engaging English without headings or any inappropriate content. Jonathan Reed was one of the richest men in California. He had made his money in the tech world and owned one of the most powerful software companies in the country. His name was known in boardrooms and business magazines, but in his personal life, Jonathan was a very private man. He lived alone in a large mansion on the hills of Silicon Valley, surrounded by glass walls, polished floors, and silence. He had no wife, no kids, and only a small group of trusted staff who kept his home running like clockwork. Among the staff was a maid named Alina Ramirez. She was in her early 50s, quiet, respectful, and always on time. She had worked in his house for over 2 years and never once caused trouble. Alina moved through the house like a shadow, wiping surfaces, organizing shelves, folding laundry, always doing her job with care, but never drawing attention to herself. Jonathan barely noticed her, and she never asked for more than what she earned. Every day, Alina arrived early and left before dark. She always refused the driver Jonathan offered to his staff. She never accepted gifts or took leftovers from the kitchen, even when the chef insisted. No one knew much about her. She never talked about her family or where she went after work. She just smiled politely, did her job, and disappeared. One evening, Jonathan was scheduled to fly to New York for a business meeting. As he sat in his car on the way to the airport, he suddenly realized he had forgotten an important folder at home. Without it, the deal he was preparing for might fall apart. Quickly told his driver to turn back. They arrived at the mansion. In the dark, the lights in the house were off, except for the front porch. Jonathan went inside, grabbed the folder from his study, and returned to the car. As they drove off again, something caught his eye from the window. In a corner of the alley not far from his house, behind a row of dumpsters, a woman was curled up on a piece of cardboard. She wore a dark sweater and had a blanket pulled tightly. Over her shoulders, her shoes were placed neatly next to her. Da-da-da. Jonathan looked closer. The woman's face was turned away, but her posture looked familiar. "Wait," he said to his driver. "Stop here." The car slowed. Jonathan leaned forward. The light from the street lamp hit the woman's face just enough for him to see. Heart dropped. It was Alina. He didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to get out of the car and speak to her. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was confusion. He sat still for a few seconds, watching her breathe quietly in her sleep. She looked peaceful, but something about the image hurt him deeply. How could someone who worked in his mansion all day end up sleeping on the street at night? "Drive," Jonathan finally whispered. The driver looked at him, unsure, but nodded and continued. On the plane, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about Alina. The image of her lying on the street stayed with him. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept going back to the alley. For the first time in years, he felt disturbed. It's not by business, not by competition, but by something real. Something human. The next morning, he returned earlier than usual from his trip. Lena was already at work cleaning the upstairs hallway. She greeted him as always, polite, calm, and professional. Jonathan stood there, silent for a moment, watching. Her wiped the glass with a cloth. "Alina," he said, "can I talk to you for a moment?" She nodded, placing her cloth on the tray and walking into the study. She stood with her hands folded, waiting. "I saw you last night," Jonathan said, quietly. On the street, Alina froze. Her eyes widened and her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She looked down, embarrassed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked gently. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "I didn't want anyone to know." Jonathan didn't speak. He let her continue. "My husband died 3 years ago," Alina said, her voice shaking. "He had cancer. He spent everything on his treatment. I had to send my children to live with relatives in Arizona. I came here to work and send money back. I couldn't afford rent anymore. I started sleeping in my car, then the car was towed. Since then, I sleep wherever I can. I didn't want to lose this job, sir. It's the only thing keeping my family alive." Jonathan listened, stunned. I'd never imagined that someone working so close to him could be going through such pain. all in silence. His world was one of numbers, deals, and profits. He had forgotten what real struggle looked like. "You've been sleeping on the street." "While working in my home?" he asked slowly. "Yes," she replied. "But I wash at the public bathroom every morning. I change into clean clothes before I come. I never wanted pity. I just wanted to work." Jonathan sat down, trying to process her words. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: shame. Not because he did something wrong directly, but because he had been blind to someone suffering right under his nose. Alina had worked in his home every day, in silence, hiding her hardship behind a calm smile. He looked up at her. "You're not going to sleep on the street anymore." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Please, sir, I don't want charity." "It's not charity," Jonathan said firmly. "It's basic human respect." She opened her mouth to protest again, but he raised a hand gently. "Just go do your work for today. Talk more tomorrow." That night, Jonathan sat alone in his office, the city lights glowing behind him. He couldn't stop thinking about Elena's story. He opened his laptop and began reading about working homelessness. He was shocked to find that many people, even those with full-time jobs, were living in their cars or on sidewalks because housing had become too expensive. These were not lazy people. They were maids, janitors, delivery drivers, people like Alina. He thought about the millions he had made, the houses he owned, the cars he barely drove, and then he thought about the woman who folded his shirts and wiped his counters, sleeping in an alley like a ghost no one saw. For the first time, Jonathan couldn't just look away. "Let me know when you're ready for part 2. I'll continue the story in the same style." Here is part 2 of the story, expanded to around 1,300 words and simple. Engaging English as requested. Alina walked into the mansion the next morning like she always did. She was wearing the same neat uniform and had her hair tied back in a simple bun, but her steps were slower. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried her cleaning supplies. After yesterday's conversation with Jonathan, she didn't know what to expect. Would he fire her? Would he change the way he looked at her? She tried to hide her worries, focusing on her usual tasks: dusting the staircase railings, organizing the guest towels, and polishing the kitchen counter. But her thoughts were loud, full of fear and hope at the same time. Meanwhile, Jonathan was upstairs in his office, drinking his morning coffee but not touching his laptop. He wasn't thinking about profits, shares, or meetings. He was thinking about Alina, the way she had stood in front of him the day before, holding back tears, but refusing to ask for help, had shaken something deep inside him. He had grown up poor himself, but he had left that life long ago. Now he lived in a world where people wore suits that cost more than Alina probably earned in a month. He finally stood up and walked downstairs. "Alina," he called gently. She turned around, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, sir?" "Please come with me." Without another word, he led her through the back hallway and into a part of the house she had never entered before, the guest wing. It had a private entrance, high ceilings, and large windows with curtains that swayed in the soft breeze. Opened a white door and stepped aside. Inside was a beautiful bedroom. It had a soft, queen-size bed, a dresser, a closet, and even a small bathroom attached. Everything was clean and welcoming. There was even a tray of fresh towels and toiletries waiting on the table. "I want you to stay here from now on," Jonathan said softly. Alina looked around in disbelief. "Sir, I can't." Yes, you can," he replied. "You're not asking for a favor. You've earned this. You've worked here for over 2 years, doing your job without ever complaining. This is not charity. This is just right." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were different. They were tears of relief and confusion and gratitude all mixed together. She shook her head slowly. "But what will the others say? What if they think I'm being given special treatment?" "I'll talk to the staff," Jonathan said. "They will understand. If anyone doesn't, I'll make sure they do." Still unsure, Alina stepped into the room. She touched the edge of the bed, almost afraid it would disappear. She had not slept in a real bed in more than a year. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, sir." Jonathan nodded and left her there for a moment of peace. Later that day, he called a meeting with his executive team. They sat around a long glass table in one of the top conference rooms at his company headquarters. All of them wore suits and ties, holding tablets and notepads, expecting another financial update. But Jonathan didn't talk about money. "I want to tell you a story," he began. "It's about someone who works in my home. She's been a loyal worker for 2 years, always on time, never asking for anything. And last week I found out. She's been sleeping on the street." The room went silent. Some looked confused. Others raised their eyebrows. "She's one of many," Jonathan continued. "There are thousands of people like her. They work full-time jobs, serve coffee, clean homes, deliver packages. And at night, they sleep in cars, parks, or shelters. They are not lazy. They are not broken. The system is." The young executive spoke up. "But sir, what does this mean for us?" "That it means," Jonathan replied, "that I'm starting something new." He stood and walked over to a board. On it were written 2 words. In bold marker, "Invisible Hands." "I'm starting a program to provide safe, small homes for workers who are housing insecure. We will build tiny home communities, clean, safe, respectful places. No one should work full-time and still sleep on the street. We will fund it ourselves and bring in partners later. This is not about charity, it's about dignity." Some executives nodded slowly. Others stayed quiet, unsure of where this was going. "Alina Ramirez," Jonathan said, "will be the first advisor on this project. She'll help us understand what people in her situation truly need." One man raised a hand. "You're putting your maid on the board of a housing project?" Jonathan looked at him calmly. "She's more experienced with homelessness than any of us sitting in this room, so yes, I am." The room stayed quiet. No one dared to argue after that. A few days later, Alina found herself sitting at a round table with architects, planners, and company staff. She wore simple clothes and kept her hands folded in her lap, unsure why she was there. But Jonathan encouraged her to speak, and when she did, people listened. She talked about the fear of sleeping on the street, the humiliation of using public restrooms to wash, the pain of hiding it from coworkers. She talked about what safety meant, and how people needed more than shelter, they needed respect. The days passed, the project moved forward. News of the story leaked to a journalist who had been following Jonathan's company for years. The headline read, "Billionaire builds homes after finding maid sleeping on street." The article spread like wildfire. Some people praised Jonathan for his actions, calling him a rare leader with a heart. Others criticized it as a publicity stunt, but Jonathan didn't care about the attention. All he cared about was that Alina now had a bed to sleep in, and soon others would too. Alina, once invisible, had become a voice. People wanted to hear her story. Nonprofits invited her to speak. City officials asked her for advice. She didn't wear fancy clothes or speak like a politician, but her words were real. People listened. Back at the mansion, things had changed. 2. The staff treated Alina with a new level of respect. Not because she had become important, but because they finally saw what she had been carrying all along. One night, Alina sat on her bed in the guest room, holding a photo of her 2 children. She smiled, knowing they would soon be able to visit. She had already started saving to bring them home, and for the first time in years, she felt hope. Downstairs, Jonathan sat in his study, going through drafts of the new housing site plans. His assistant entered the room with a fresh cup of tea. "Sir," she said, "the mayor wants to schedule a meeting about supporting your program." Jonathan nodded. "Let's do it." He looked out the window, where the city lights glowed in the distance. Everything had started from one unexpected moment, seeing Alina sleeping on the street. That moment had changed everything. Not just for her, but for him too. Let me know when you'd like me to continue with part 3, and I'll write it in the same simple and emotional style. Here is part 3, expanded to around 1,300 words and simple. Engaging English. As you requested, the morning sun was shining through the windows of the guest room as Alina slowly woke up. For a moment, she didn't move. She just lay there, wrapped in warm blankets, listening to the peaceful silence. There was no sound of traffic, no cold wind, and no fear of someone waking her up to make her leave. She was safe. She was in a real bed. She didn't have to run anymore. She sat up and looked around. The soft curtains, the little potted plant on the table, and the gentle hum of the air conditioner all reminded her this wasn't a dream. She lived here now, in the same house she cleaned. But this time, she wasn't just the maid. She was someone. Being seen, someone whose voice mattered. Downstairs, Jonathan was already up, sitting in the garden with a cup of coffee. He had changed over the past few weeks, though most people didn't know it yet. Something inside him had shifted the night he saw Alina sleeping on the street. For years he had lived with numbers and profits as his main concern. But now he thought more about people, about stories like Elena's that were quietly hidden. Behind polite smiles. He looked up when Alina walked into the garden, holding a tray with 2 glasses of fresh juice. "You don't have to serve me," he said gently. "I know," she replied with a small smile, "but I like to. It makes me feel normal." They both sat down under the tree, sipping quietly for a while. Then Jonathan leaned forward. "I want to show you something," he said. Took out a folder from his bag and placed it on the table. Inside were printed sketches and notes. They were designs for small homes, about the size of a studio apartment, but clean, beautiful, and safe. Each one had a bed, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and even a little porch. "These are the homes we're going to build," he said. "You helped inspire this." Alina picked up one of the sketches and studied it. Her hands shook a little. "They look peaceful," she whispered. "That's the point," Jonathan replied. "People like you deserve peace." Alina smiled, but it was more than just joy. It was something deeper, something healing. For years she had carried the weight of being invisible. Now someone saw her, and that meant everything. Jonathan continued, "We'll build the first set of homes just outside the city. There will be a garden in the middle, a shared space for meals and laundry, and security at the gate. No one will have to worry about being thrown out in the middle of the night." "And who will live there?" Alina asked. "People like you?" He said, "People who work hard but still sleep on buses or in shelters. They'll be chosen carefully. It's not out of pity, but because they've earned it." A few days later, Jonathan held a press conference to announce the project. It was held in a large hall downtown, filled with reporters, nonprofit leaders, and curious citizens. The media lights flashed. People whispered to one another, wondering what a billionaire tech CEO had to say this time. Jonathan stood on the stage, dressed in a simple suit, with a calm but serious look on his face. He didn't talk about profits or growth charts. Instead, he told the story of a woman who worked in his home. A woman who, despite having a job, had nowhere to sleep. A woman who had served silently for years while carrying a hidden pain. He didn't say Elena's full name to protect her privacy, but he told her story with respect, and then to everyone's surprise, he invited her to the stage. The room fell quiet as Alina stepped up beside him. She wore a clean dress and simple shoes. Her hands were still folded in front of her, just as they always had been at work. But her eyes no longer looked down. They looked forward, into the crowd. She spoke softly but clearly. "I never asked for help because I thought it was wrong to expect anything more. I believed that if I worked hard, maybe one day things would change. But the truth is, many of us work hard and still suffer quietly. It's not because we're lazy, but because no one sees us." She paused. The room was silent. "Mr. Reed saw me, and now he's helping others like me. This project is not about charity. It's about respect. It's about giving people back the dignity they lost." When she stepped back, people stood and clapped. It wasn't just for Jonathan. It was for Elena, for her courage, her honesty, and the way her words had touched their hearts. In the weeks that followed, the project named Invisible Hands gained attention across the country. Donations came in. Volunteers signed up. Architects and city planners offered their time. Jonathan's team started building the first village on a piece of land near the city's edge. But not everyone was happy. Some people on social media began accusing Jonathan of using Elena's story as a publicity move. Others claimed the homes would bring problems into nice neighborhoods. A few news articles questioned his motives. Jonathan ignored the noise. So did Alina. Instead, they focused on the real work. Visiting the construction site, talking to people who applied to live there, listening to their stories, single mothers, delivery drivers, retired veterans, and even teachers people with jobs, but no homes. One afternoon, Jonathan took Elena to the construction site. The small houses were halfway built now. Wooden frames stood in neat rows, and workers moved around with purpose. Elena walked among them, touching the walls, looking inside. "They're real," she said quietly. "Yes," Jonathan replied, "and they'll be ready in 2 months." They stood there in silence, watching the workers hammer and drill. Then Jonathan turned to her. "I want you to help choose who lives here, me," Elena asked, surprised. "You've lived that life. You'll know who truly needs it and who will respect it." Elena nodded slowly. For the first time in years, she felt not just seen, but trusted. Back at the mansion, things changed in small ways too. The chef started preparing a special meal for Elena every Friday. The gardener brought her flowers. The driver offered her rides without being asked, not because she had become famous, but because now they knew her story. It reminded them to be kinder. Jonathan's heart also changed. He began spending more time talking to his staff, learning about their lives. He even started attending community meetings and quietly funded scholarships for workers' children. One night, Elena sat at her desk in the guest room, writing a letter to her daughter. She described the new house project, the people she was helping, and the strange but wonderful path that had brought her here. She wrote about the man who used to walk past her like she was invisible and who now sat beside her at meetings, asking her opinion. She ended the letter with a simple line, "Sometimes the smallest kindness can change everything." In another part of the city, a billboard lit up with a new message, "Invisible hands, dignity for every worker." Let me know when you're ready for part 4, and I'll continue with the same emotional and simple storytelling style. Here's part 4 of the story expanded to around 1,300 words. In simple and engaging English, with no inappropriate content, the morning was cool, and the smell of fresh paint filled the air. Small houses now stood proudly in rows, their white walls gleaming under the sunlight. Each one had a tiny porch, a door with a number, and flowers planted just outside the window. It had taken weeks of hard work, careful planning, and quiet determination. But the first Invisible Hands village was finally ready. Elena stood at the entrance with Jonathan, holding a list in her hand, her eyes filled with emotion as she looked around at the finished homes. Just months ago, she had been sleeping behind dumpsters, trying to stay warm through the night. She was helping others find shelter, peace, and dignity. People began to arrive one by one. These were not people with signs or begging cups. These were workers' grocery clerks, restaurant servers, elderly caregivers, and single parents. Had jobs, yet they had struggled with housing. Now, they were invited to live here with no rent for the first year. As long as they contributed to the community by helping others or working in the shared garden, kitchen, or laundry area. Elena greeted each person personally. She had helped. Interviewed them weeks before. She remembered their stories: Maria, the school janitor who slept in her car; Henry, the grandfather who worked as a part-time security guard but had no home; and Lisa, the young woman with a baby who worked 2 jobs just to buy diapers. Jonathan watched as Elena handed out the keys. She spoke to each new resident with warmth and kindness, making sure they felt welcome. These weren't just buildings. They were a fresh start for people who had been forgotten for too long. Inside the village, volunteers were busy setting up a welcome table with warm soup, blankets, and starter kits. Children ran around the little garden in the center, laughing for the first time in days. One little boy saw the porch swing in front of his new house and shouted with joy, "Mama, look, we have a swing." Elena smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. Jonathan walked over and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "You did this?" he said. "No," she replied softly. "We did this together." A few hours later, there was a small ceremony. Local leaders and city officials had been invited. News cameras were there too, but Jonathan asked them to focus on the community, not just him. This wasn't about his money. It was about what could happen when one person chooses to see another not as a worker, but as a human being. The mayor gave a short speech. "This village is not a gift," she said. "It's a reminder that those who serve us also need support. And today, thanks to the vision of Mr. Reed and the wisdom of Ms. Ramirez, we are taking a step toward fairness. Then Alina was asked to say a few words. She stood at the small wooden stage holding a piece of paper in her hand. But when she looked at the crowd of smiling faces, people now holding keys to their new homes, she folded the paper and spoke from her heart. I used to think staying quiet was the best way to survive. I thought if I just worked hard and didn't ask for much, maybe things would get better. But the truth is, silence can keep us hidden. And when we're hidden, people don't see our struggles. She paused, taking a deep breath. But Mr. Reed saw me. And because of that, everything changed. It's not just for me, but for all of us. Here, this place is more than shelter. It's proof that someone cared enough to act. The crowd clapped warmly. Some cried. Others just held their loved ones and nodded. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the village lit up with soft lights. Families were inside their homes making dinner. A group of kids played soccer near the garden. Elena sat on a bench near the edge of the property, looking at everything they had created. Jonathan joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. Everything. Okay? He asked. Alina nodded. It's more than okay. I never thought I'd live to see this. They sipped quietly for a moment, enjoying the peaceful sounds of laughter and conversation. Then Jonathan said, I've been thinking, it shouldn't be the only one. Alina looked at him with surprise. We can build more, he continued, one in every major city, and maybe one day, even in small towns, we can partner with companies, city councils, churches, whoever wants to help. I have the resources, you have the wisdom. Together, we can take this further. Elena's eyes lit up. Do you really think we can do that? I know we can, Jonathan said. We've already done the hardest part. We cared. The rest is just building. The next day, plans for expansion began. Jonathan's team drew up blueprints for future villages. Alina helped form a small group of advisors, people who had once been homeless, just like her. It would lead the way with real insight, not just guesses. As more people heard about the project, support grew. Formerly homeless individuals began writing letters thanking the team. Volunteers came from all over to help with construction. Even celebrities started donating silently. But Jonathan refused to let it become about fame. He told his team, the moment this becomes about headlines, we lose our purpose. This is about human lives, not attention. Weeks later, Jonathan and Alina were invited to speak at a national conference on housing and poverty. It was a big event, filled with powerful people in suits. Alina wore a simple blue dress and carried a photo of her old street corner in her purse, not to share, but to remind herself where she came from. On stage, Jonathan said, a strong society is not judged by how much money its richest people make. It's judged by how it treats the people who serve, clean, care, and protect. Then Alina spoke. Her voice was calm but steady. I am not special. I was just one of many. But someone saw me and believed I was worth helping. Remember anything today, let it be this: people don't need pity. They need a chance, a door, a key. The room gave them a standing ovation. As they flew home, Alina looked out the plane window and whispered, I still can't believe all this started with one moment. You could have ignored me that night. Jonathan smiled. I almost did. She looked at him curiously. Something told me not to, he said, and I'm glad I listened. Their journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. They had lit a small flame, and now they would carry it across cities, hoping it would grow into a fire that warmed thousands more. Let me know when you're ready for part 5, and I'll finish the story with the same emotion and simple language. Here is part 5, expanded to around 1,300 words in simple, engaging English. With no inappropriate content, 1 year had passed since the day Alina received the key to her own room in Jonathan's mansion. That small act of kindness had started a chain of events that changed many lives. First, Invisible Hands Village had now become home to dozens of families who once lived in cars, shelters, or on the streets. Children who once feared bedtime now slept safely. And hard-working adults finally had a door to close, a kitchen to cook in, a space to call their own. Alina was no longer just a housemaid. She had become a voice, a leader, and a bridge between people with power and people in pain. But despite her new role, she still chose to live in the guest house at Jonathan's mansion. She said it reminded her of where everything started. She still helped around the house when she could. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to stay connected to the woman she had always been: humble, honest, and hardworking. Jonathan, too, had changed. He had started the year focused on business deals and technology, but now he spent most of his time working on the Invisible Hands Foundation. He had hired a team that included former social workers, builders, and even people who had once been homeless. Alina helped lead the hiring process, and her advice was always heard first. Together, they opened 2 more villages, one in Los Angeles and another in Austin, which was filled with small homes, peaceful gardens, and community spaces where people could share meals, laughter, and hope. People began calling them villages of second chances. One morning, as Alina sat in the garden reading letters from new residents, Jonathan approached with something in his hand. It was an invitation beautifully printed with gold edges. "Alina," he said with a small smile, "you're being honored." She looked at the invitation. It was from a national human rights group, inviting her to New York City for a special award ceremony. She had been selected as one of 5 people across the country recognized for acts of courage and compassion. Elena's eyes widened. "Me? But I didn't do anything special." "You changed lives," Jonathan replied. "Did you help me become a better man?" A few weeks later, they flew to New York. Alina wore a simple cream-colored dress and a silver necklace Jonathan had given her as a thank-you gift. When she walked onto the stage, the audience stood and clapped. Bright lights shined in her eyes, but she stood tall, holding a small piece of paper with her speech. She spoke softly, but with great meaning. "I never thought I would be standing here. A year ago, I was sleeping behind a dumpster, hoping no one would notice me, but then someone did. Not with money, but with eyes that saw me as a person. We all want to be seen, to be heard, to be given a fair chance. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who got the key to a door that should never have been locked in the first place." The audience was silent for a moment. Then they applauded, some wiping away tears. Back at home, the recognition brought more attention to the foundation. Donations grew. More companies reached out to offer support, but Jonathan and Alina never let fame change their mission. They continued to meet every applicant for new homes in person. They listened to their stories and reminded them that they were not just getting a house, they were getting a future. One morning, a man named David came to apply. He had been a math teacher for 30 years but had lost everything after a medical emergency. Now he lived in a tent behind a shopping center. Alina sat with him, listened, and gently placed a key in his hand. "You still have something to give," she said. "This is not the end." David moved into the 4th village, which had just opened on the edge of town. It had a small library, and soon David started tutoring kids from the neighborhood. The homes did not just offer shelter, they gave people a reason to live again as time passed. Alina found herself being invited to speak at schools, churches, and even government meetings. She never used fancy words or tried to impress anyone. She simply told the truth. She often ended her talks with a simple sentence. "You don't need to be rich to make a difference. You just need to care." One day, Jonathan surprised Alina with something special. He took her to a quiet piece of land just outside the city. It was peaceful, with tall trees, birds singing, a small stream running along the edge. "This is yours," he said. Alina looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? I bought this land for you. Build a house. A real one. For yourself and your children. You've done so much for everyone else. It's time you have a place of your own." Tears filled her eyes. "Jonathan, I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it," he said. "You deserve this." With his help, Elena's new home was built within a few months. It was small, but full of light and warmth. Her daughter and son, now grown and doing well, came to visit. They sat at the table, eating together as a family for the first time in years. Laughter filled the air. It was the kind of moment Alina had dreamed of while sleeping cold and alone. On the street, on the wall near her kitchen, she hung a framed photo, a picture of her first night in the guest house at Jonathan's mansion. She kept it there to remind herself of how far she had come. Meanwhile, Jonathan continued his mission quietly. He turned down big interviews and awards. When asked why, he simply said, "I'm not the story. Elena is. And all the people she's helped, I just opened the door." Years later, at a local university graduation, Alina was invited to speak. She stood on the stage in front of hundreds of students and said, "Don't just chase success. Chase meaning, because meaning will carry you when everything else falls apart." That day, a young woman in the crowd wrote Elena's words in her notebook. Years later, that young woman would go on to start her own program to help homeless youth. Elena's message had reached farther than she would ever know. As the sun set behind Elena's little home, she stood on her porch looking at the quiet land around her. The wind gently moved the trees. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing. A mother was cooking, and a man was reading a book in the community garden. All of this had started with one small moment. One billionaire, one maid, and one act of seeing what others ignored. And in that moment, Alina knew with all her heart sometimes, the smallest kindness can open the biggest doors. If you need an image description, YouTube title, or want to turn this into a voiceover script, just let me know.